Okay, so we're going to do one long period today that's going to begin with, well, really it begins with the rise of Jacksonian democracy in the mid-1820s, and it's going to end with the end of the American frontier and the beginning of America becoming a world power in 1890, okay? So, in looking at our first category that we start with, since 1890, because the United States has become a global power, when we looked at America and the world, and what we've decided is our dividing line, of course, is the Civil War, okay, for the study of this period. When we look at America and the world, we look at foreign policy, there's not as much here, right? The United States is still very much an isolationist but growing nation throughout the course of the 19th century. In fact, it's really the Civil War that begins the process of the growth of America as a global industrialized colossus in many respects. So for us, there's less here in American foreign policy, but what is here and what does happen during this period is very important for the understanding for the growth of the country leading into the time period when it does become a world power at the dawn of the 20th century. So in the beginning, from the mid-1820s to the beginning of the Civil War, the following things happen in American foreign policy. In the 1840s, there's a number of boundary disputes with Great Britain over the border with Canada. All become solved during the Polk administration by 1846, and we get the current border for what would be Washington State today and the contiguous boundary for the United States with Canada by 1846, using Polk's power as President of the United States and his negotiating strategies with Great Britain during this period. We also go to war with Mexico, beginning again in 1846. It's a two-year conflict. It results in an American victory. And with the victory in the war with Mexico, we acquire the following new territories, which become the future states of parts of New Mexico, Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, and little bits and pieces of Wyoming and Idaho as well. So the war with Mexico lasts for about 18 months, but ultimately it sets the stage for really two things: American expansion, further expansion into the West, all the way to the Pacific, right? So beginning the process of fulfilling this idea of manifest destiny, which we're going to get to here in a moment, right? But it provides the catalyst for that happening. And the other thing that we see that's happening with the war with Mexico is the period is also marked by increased sectional divisions. Now, this means that we're going to be stepping largely in this period into talking about the development of American politics that lead us up to the Civil War, and also the development of American politics that will eventually lead us to America becoming a global power, but still politically divided by the dawn of the 20th century. Okay? It's interesting, for the first time in U.S. history, we actually opened up to Eastern markets. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry's voyages to Japan actually opened up the first relationship between the United States and an Asian nation. I guess for us, right, it's a great irony in American history that the relationship that we open up with an Asian country is with Japan first. As a side note, the United States has a huge influence on the development and modernization of Japan. During World War II, Japan becomes our arch nemesis in the Pacific War. But today in the modern era, after Japan is rebuilt by the United States through the Marshall Plan of the 1950s, Japan becomes one of the closest partners in terms of global trade that the United States still possesses to this very day. And there's still a good relationship between the United States and Japan in the modern era. Native American conflicts occur throughout the period. From 1825 to 1860, there are sporadic conflicts with Native Americans that occur on and off during the period, as Americans, of course, are making their way westward during the period leading up to the Civil War. But largely, we can characterize American foreign policy during this period as isolationist. After the Civil War, American foreign policy changes dramatically. After the Civil War, we see the rise of American big business with figures that all of us would recognize. People like John Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan. In fact, none of these men actually fight in the Civil War, although Carnegie does work as a telegraph operator under the auspices of the Lincoln administration during the war. It's safe to say that none of these men actually fight in it. Another robber baron, famous industrialist, and perhaps the first of them, Cornelius Vanderbilt, loses a son during the Civil War, but he himself, of course, is not involved in the war as well. But because of their efforts, American industry becomes a global phenomenon. America experiences a first industrial revolution during this period, but American industry becomes globalized slowly during this period, such that by the dawn of the 20th century, America is one of the leading industrial powers in the world. Native American wars continue after the Civil War, but what's really interesting is that this is where the Western frontier comes to an end. As we'll talk about in a moment, all of these things are intertwined with one another, but I want to spend just a moment here for just a second. When the Civil War came to an end, American big business had considerable interest in, for example, the mining industry. There's the growth of the food industry with the cattle drives after the Civil War. And so as the food industry grew, of course, it was easier for more people to live in America's cities. So we begin this trend after the Civil War that really comes to a crossroads in the early 1920s, but is continuing to this day in American life, where Americans are moving from its small towns and rural areas from its frontier into its major cities. The growth of the food industry at the end of the Civil War really gives you that process. The other thing that I think is important to note is this whenever we talk about the Native American wars of the period. It's the mining industry. Every time mining claims are found, and every time there's an American economic interest in the West, it's the Native Americans that suffer. First, the wars on the Southern Plains from 1867 to roughly 1875. During that period, the Comanche and the Kiowa, and eventually the Apache by 1886, all become subjugated by the U.S. Army. The cattle drives, the expansion of the transcontinental railroad system have a lot to do with bringing these tribes on the Southern Plains to become subjugated and into reservation systems in what is Oklahoma today largely, right, by the middle of the decade of the 1870s. But it's the mining interests that also brings the United States into war with the Plains Indians of the North, such as the Sioux and the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. And in the late 1870s, right, there's a series of wars that are fought. The Nez Perce are among the last of those groups to be defeated and surrender. By 1881, by the time Helen Hunt Jackson writes her book, A Century of Dishonor, from the end of the Revolutionary War with the Battle of Yorktown to the publication of her book in 1881, she speaks about the growing trend that occurred throughout a century of time in American life in terms of the treatments towards the Native Americans. It's safe to say that yes, the Native American wars are over by 1881, but one of the things, and I should have put this down with the environment, and I did not, we'll talk about the destruction of the buffalo. In fact, that's something that needs to be here. In fact, I'm going to put it off to the side here because it is very important for us. And we're going to put it up here with another phenomenon. Of course, that is the growth of American commercial farming and barbed wire. We'll get to that here in a moment. But for us, let's stick with this theme for where we are. By the late 1880s, the Dawes Act has been put in place. Now, I have this with migration, and we are going to touch on this here in a moment. But what that essentially did was it made the attempt to create a reservation system where Native Americans would be given land, and it tried to Americanize them, to assimilate them. There's this larger process in American foreign policy that's sort of going on during this period. American industries are recruiting immigrants to come in and work for them from around the world, largely from European nations during this period. There are extensive numbers of Chinese immigrants, and we're going to get to this here in a moment, that come to work, for example, on the Transcontinental Railroad system during this period. But the Native Americans are very much representative of what's happening during this period, where we're trying to Americanize immigrants into the overall fabric of the American identity. And what happens is simply this. We're trying to make Native Americans, through the Dawes Act, through the reservation program, into the larger white American community. So we send them to schools, we put them into this reservation system, and we try to make them farmers. Unfortunately, because we're dealing with people who had been migratory for much of their life, who had never lived a sedentary lifestyle, we see that the reservation system is going to have some systematic failures because of this process. And unfortunately, one of the things that ends up happening is that Native Americans end up selling off some of their land to speculators later. But in other instances, right, Native Americans simply cannot make a living without having substantial government assistance, because the lands that they were given during the Dawes Act program were actually quite poor for agriculture. So you have two problems. You have a group of people who is not experienced in this type of work on the one hand, and then you have land that is not suitable for what they're trying to do on the other, right? So the Native American wars end by 1890 with the disaster at Wounded Knee, which is really symbolic of not just the period coming to an end and not just the frontier coming to an end, but the way the Native American way of life came to an end. This was a massacre on the plains of South Dakota. And in essence, much like the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, which happened during the Civil War, Wounded Knee, which occurred in December of 1890, was a disaster of epic proportions in a sense, because Native Americans who were trying to surrender, who were a part of what we would call a ghost dance craze. This idea that if you wanted to have a return to the traditional way of life, right, dancing would make you immune to the bullets that would be fired by American soldiers. In December of 1890, as the Native Americans of the last Sioux band to surrender are giving up their weapons, a shot is accidentally fired. Indiscriminately, the U.S. soldiers kill or wipe out the vast majority of the Native Americans who have been disarmed by this time, or by the time of the incident occurring. This showcases, of course, the hatred that the two sides had for one another, us versus them in this instance, right? But it also showcases something else. The wars for the plains, the Native American conflicts, that had been ongoing for a century plus by the time of Wounded Knee, were wars of inescapable brutality on both sides. But it's the Native Americans that suffer tremendously. The loss of their land, the loss of their culture and their way of life, and certainly the loss of their identity, which begins to occur with the Dawes Act, as well as they are sent to schools and assimilated into the larger American culture. Politics and power, we're probably going to spend quite some time here. Now, it's hard to put a particular event in a particular place, but we're going to add what I think is the most important event of the entire period here. And so we're going to spend a lot of time, and I'm going to put an asterisk by the Civil War, though we won't spend a lot of time on the war itself. We're going to spend a lot of time on the politics of the era getting us to the war and what the politics of America looked like after the war. In the mid-1820s, coming out of the War of 1812, there are really two different types of Republican. There's only one political party by 1824. Now, we're going to talk about the election of 1824 on Monday. That's what we're going to end with, which gives you the rise of Andrew Jackson. But Andrew Jackson was already a household name by 1824. Why? Because he was a hero of the War of 1812. He's the last of the presidents to actually have fought in the Revolutionary War. He fought in the Revolutionary War. He was actually captured by the British as a teenager, right? He is, unlike political figures of today, truly a self-made man. Jackson is born into obscurity. He rises above his humble origins. He becomes a well-experienced politician and military man. He also becomes a very successful plantation owner and one of the founding fathers of the politics of the state of Tennessee. In other words, Jackson is a man of the South in a sense, but he's also a man of the growing West in the mid-1820s. One of the interesting things about Jacksonian democracy is this. In the election of 1824, again that we'll talk about on Monday, Jackson loses that election despite the fact that he had an overwhelming majority of the popular support from the voters in America. And why is this? Why does the election of 1824 change the calculus to 1828? Well, there's a couple of things that are at work here, but the one that's fundamentally the most important is this, okay? White males above the age of 21 can now vote regardless of whether they own property or not. Now, what we have to think about is this. When we're looking at Americans in the mid-1820s, early in this period, the vast majority of Americans are still farmers by trade. If they do work in a city, they work as a merchant or small businessman. So the mid-1820s are on the verge of what you think of as the first industrial revolution. But the people that we're talking about, small farmers, small merchants, and shopkeepers, largely favor a candidate of the West like Andrew Jackson. Now, there's a reason for this. Jackson's a self-made man. Jackson is, in other words, more like them. He's more easily identifiable as a politician. He's not a person of the city. He's not a person of the Northeast. He's not a person of the growing industrial revolution that is occurring at the beginning of this period. In other words, he's a representation of the new and the old during this period, if you're from the South and the West. Plus, Jackson will, when he picks his running mate, Martin Van Buren, he's going to have an alliance with New York politicians because Van Buren is one of the first politicians to actually establish what we think of as the interest of having a political party and a national campaign apparatus backing you up in that process during election time. But without a doubt, the political feature that defines this period is sectional division. While Jackson is a man of the South and the West, Jackson is also a man, a political figure that has many issues on his plate that he feels are representative of him as a personal politician. Now, I did not put this up for the economics of the period, but I certainly should because it's really important, and that's Jackson's bank war and the issues of and the issue of tariffs. You see, we sort of have to step back for just a moment whenever we're talking about the political parties during this period and we're talking about the growth of sectional division coming out of the War of 1812. First of all, in 1819, America experiences one of its first major financial downturns or financial panics, a recession, okay? That recession actually occurred in the cotton market after the War of 1812. And that's because for the first time, Americans are beginning the process of producing cotton on a global market scale. But also for the very first time, we're seeing new lands that are being opened for the production of cotton as well. Plus there's cotton coming into textile mills in Britain and France. and the American Northeast that are coming from other sources from around the world for the first time too. And so what's interesting is that farmers who are always dependent upon a banking system, right? We talked about this quite a bit whenever we went through the period yesterday, right? Farmers depend on the American banking system because they depend on to expand their businesses, to buy equipment, to buy seed, and especially to buy land to expand their operations. They are dependent upon a banking system that allows for the expansion of credit. During the Panic of 1819, there was this sense that one of the problems with the banking system was with the Bank of the United States, that it did not allow for credit to flow easily enough, and it didn't regulate the sense that farmers were looking for in terms of having a stable economy coming out of this recession. So what's really interesting is that because the Bank of the United States does not handle this crisis that we're going to talk about on Monday very well at all, it leads to distrust of the Second Bank of the United States, particularly by farmers in the growing South and West during this period. Well, Jackson shares their mistrust, okay? And one of the major political issues of Jackson's tenure is the bank war, okay? Jackson also favors lower tariffs. Why? High protective tariffs were being used for the very first time for a couple of different reasons. Now, they've been used earlier to pay back debts, for example, coming out of the Revolutionary War. But they're also, during this period, being used for the first industrial revolution to begin the process of protecting America's growing textile industries. So we have this problem. If you're a Democrat and you're from the South and the West, you probably favor having low tariff rates because as a farmer, you compete with your agricultural goods not just in a national market but also in an international market. You also probably favor, right, having a deregulated banking system, right, with independent banks that are close to you so that you can have more cash on hand, right? These issues are nothing new in American life for America's farmers, but this is probably the first time that, at least on the timeline, that we spend some time with this issue, right? The other thing is that if you're Democrats, you probably support something else. You probably support America's expansion into the West because you see the additional land as the opportunity to make additional capital, additional money for yourself in agriculture. So you probably favor things like, for example, what we were looking at a moment ago with Native American removal. The other thing that I think is important for us to understand, also if you're Democrats, you probably favor the building of some infrastructure, but you may not favor the federal government at this point in time being behind the creation of that infrastructure, right? So let's think about this for just a moment. If you're a Democrat, right, you become the party of Andrew Jackson because you favor these things. If you're a Whig, you oppose the policies of Andrew Jackson because you do not favor them. You favor high protective tariffs because you want to protect the growth of American industry. You favor a regulated banking system because businesses depend on the flow of credit, and they also depend upon loans from this banking system. And you favor what? A stable currency, right? Jackson opposes these things, right? And so do the people of his party. So there's a couple of things that are at work here. In 1828, one of the perhaps worst tariff bills in American history is passed. The tariff actually raises rates on certain items. When we say certain items, these are items that are agricultural products that are being produced in the South. Southern states go up in arms over the issue. Jackson's just been elected. Jackson's a Southerner. South Carolina refuses to actually have the duties, tax duties, or customs duties collected within its ports for its states, places such as Charleston, for example. And what's really interesting is this causes a crisis, right? While northern states, who are about to become the Whigs, right, are favored by the Whigs, northern states actually favor a high protective tariff because they want the growth of their textile industries to begin, to continue, right? If you're the southern states like South Carolina, you do not wish to have high protective tariffs because you're trying to sell your goods on a global scale. South Carolina almost gives us the Civil War 30 years before the Civil War happens by refusing to pay the tariff duties of the Tariff of Abominations, as they call it, or the Tariff of 1828. Jackson gives us the first direct use of presidential power to force a state to comply with a law in such a manner, since George Washington had done essentially the same thing during the Whiskey Rebellion. Case in point, Jackson's vice president is a man by the name of John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun had been a congressman prior to becoming, and he had been a cabinet member under the Madison administration prior to becoming Jackson's vice president. Jackson actually splits with his vice president over the issue of the tariff of 1828. And Jackson actually gets, through Congress, the ability to enforce the law, a force bill. By 1830, this issue comes to a head. It looks like South Carolina is not only going to nullify the law, but they might secede from the Union. Jackson threatens to use military force to have the duties collected and to have South Carolina comply with the law. Eventually, South Carolina backs down. The crisis is averted for now. Jackson also goes to war with the Bank of the United States. This bank war begins in Jackson's second term. Jackson's reelected in 1832. It begins, however, before Jackson is elected for the second term. The Bank of the United States has strong supporters, people like Henry Clay, senator from Kentucky, former Speaker of the House, and former cabinet member under Secretary of State under the administration of John Quincy Adams. Clay supports what we refer to now as the national system. What is the national system? Well, think of the national system as the Whigs' political platform. This idea that you're going to use the federal government to build infrastructure, right, to create a market economy. The federal government's going to build canals, it's going to build roads, it's going to create bridges. In other words, it's going to try to create infrastructure to connect America's rural areas with its growing market towns. And Clay wants to use the power of the federal government to create this infrastructure, right? But Clay, in order to do this, believes that you have to have a strong national bank, right? You have to have a strong centralized financial system that can be used to make investments for such improvements. The Bank of the United States, Second Bank of the United States at this point in time, had been chartered in 1816. Its charter is not up for another 20 years, right? It will be chartered for 20 years, initial charter in 1816. Clay decides that he wants to push for the rechartering of the National Bank in 1832 and make it an election year issue against Andrew Jackson. Well, this also allows for Jackson to gin up, so to speak, his supporters, right? Jackson has no love for the bank, and most of his supporters, as we've talked about earlier, have no love for the Bank of the United States either, right? They see it as an institution that has at its core interest in helping the big money interests of New England, of the Northeast, right? And they see it as the instrument for the growth of industry in those areas. In other words, they don't see the bank as benefiting them at all, right? And they see from the Panic of 1819, right, what they feel like is the power of the misuse of such an institution. Add insult to injury that Jackson picks a fight with the chairman of the bank, right, a man by the name of Nicholas Biddle. Jackson had a way of making personalizing the issues that he did not like with people who were in charge of institutions that he was not in favor of. And the Second Bank of the United States and his war on it is really a classic example of that. While people in Congress, members of Congress, particularly Whigs and some Democrats, favor the rechartering of the bank, Jackson vetoes it, making it the election issue that it becomes. Eventually, Jackson is elected in 1832 as President of the United States. But what becomes really interesting about the bank war is this. Jackson goes through several secretaries of the Treasury before he finally finds someone, Roger B. Taney, who will take the assets, the money, out of the Second Bank of the United States and put it into pet banks. Small banks, usually that are in states and cities that are favorable locales and loyal to and have great support for Andrew Jackson and his policies. What's interesting about these pet banks is simply this, right? When Jackson takes the funds out of these banks themselves are not regulated, right? It leads to widespread inflation. Jackson compounds the problem. One of the major issues of the period, right, if you're a person living as a Democrat in the West, the New West during this period, and the South, one of the major issues, of course, is buying land, right, and being able to purchase land from the federal government. So and we're going to talk about what led to this process, which is Native American removal here in just a second, Jackson's third major issue in his administration, right? One of the things that we also have to talk about is that Jackson issues what's called the Specie Circular. Well, what does this mean? Well, this means that you have to be able to, in order to purchase public land, you have to be able to do that in either gold or silver. Well, there's a problem with that, right? You have a shaky banking system, and you also begin to have the problem of flooding this market with currency, right? And in other words, you have these pet banks issuing their own currency, right? And there's no regulation here. And then you have this added problem. Now you can only buy public land with this either gold or silver, right? So what happens is, by the time Jackson leaves office, with a shaky banking system and a problem in the way in which Americans are now able to purchase public land, Jackson basically creates two things. Number one, he had gotten rid of America's debt for the first time in American history. And while that's a good thing on the one hand, on the other hand, Jackson's banking policies, his war on the Bank of the United States and his destabilization of the banking system leads to the second Great Recession, or what we refer to as the Panic of 1837 in American history.